The first elephant appeared at the edge of the property just after dawn on March 4, 2012. The security guard at Thula Private Game Reserve in South Africa noticed her standing motionless at the fence line, her massive silhouette dark against the pink sky. Within an hour, she was joined by another, then another. By mid-morning, an entire herd of wild elephants stood in complete silence outside the gates of the reserve, their trunks raised slightly, as if sensing something on the wind that humans could not perceive. What made this gathering extraordinary was not just the number of elephants, but the distance they had traveled. These animals had walked over 12 hours through dangerous territory, crossing busy roads, navigating farmland, where elephants were often shot on sight, and passing through areas controlled by rival herds. They had risked everything to reach this specific location. And they had arrived on the exact day that Lawrence Anthony, the man they had known for 15 years, had died of a heart attack inside his home on the reserve. But this herd was not alone. Within hours, a second group of elephants appeared from a completely different direction. This group had traveled even farther, emerging from wild bush country where they had lived undisturbed for years. The two herds positioned themselves on opposite sides of the property, maintaining their traditional separation from each other, but united in their purpose. They had come to pay their respects to the human who had saved their lives. For 2 days, these wild elephants remained at the Anthony property. They did not eat. They did not make their usual vocalizations. They simply stood in that profound stillness that elephants adopt during their mourning rituals, a behavior documented by researchers but never before witnessed in response to a human death. The staff at Thula watched in amazement as these massive creatures held vigil for the man known across the world as the Elephant Whisperer. To understand why wild elephants would travel dangerous distances and risk their survival to mourn a human being, you need to understand the remarkable story of Lawrence Anthony himself and the desperate elephants who arrived at his gates 15 years earlier, on the verge of being destroyed because humans had labeled them too dangerous to live. Lawrence Anthony was not a trained wildlife biologist or veterinarian. He was a conservationist, an entrepreneur, and a man who had spent most of his adult life in Africa developing a deep and intuitive understanding of the continent's wildlife. By 1999, he had established Thula as a private game reserve in the heart of Zululand, creating a sanctuary where endangered species could live without the constant threat of poaching or habitat destruction. The reserve covered over 5,000 acres of diverse terrain, from dense bush to open grassland, with rivers and wetlands that supported an extraordinary variety of life. Lawrence's approach to conservation was unconventional. While many wildlife experts relied purely on scientific methodology and maintained strict emotional distance from the animals they studied, Lawrence believed in forming genuine relationships based on respect and communication. He spent countless hours simply observing elephants, learning to interpret their body language, understanding the subtle vocalizations that carried meaning across distances, and recognizing individual personalities within the herds. His critics called this approach sentimental and unscientific. His supporters recognized it as a form of wisdom that conventional training often overlooked. In early 1999, Lawrence received an urgent phone call that would test every belief he held about elephant intelligence, memory, and capacity for trust. A wildlife management officer in a neighboring province had a problem. A herd of 9 elephants, led by a matriarch named Nana, had become what officials termed problem animals. These elephants had been traumatized by years of culling operations, where wildlife officials had systematically killed adult elephants to control population numbers. The survivors, including Nana and her family, had witnessed these killings and had learned to fear and hate humans with intensity that made them genuinely dangerous. The herd had escaped from their original reserve by breaking through multiple electric fences, demonstrating both intelligence and determination. They raided crops, destroyed property, and showed aggressive behavior toward any human who approached. Several attempts to relocate them had failed because the elephants simply escaped again, their fear and rage making them impossible to contain. The wildlife authorities had made their final decision. This herd would be destroyed within 72 hours unless someone was willing to take them. Lawrence Anthony said yes without hesitation, despite warnings from colleagues, despite the obvious dangers, despite having no proven method for rehabilitating elephants this traumatized. His wife Françoise and his staff at Thula thought he had lost his mind. Taking in a herd of traumatized, human-hating elephants was not just risky, it was potentially suicidal. These animals had every reason to kill any human they encountered, and the strength to do so effortlessly. The transfer operation was conducted with military precision. The elephants were tranquilized and transported in massive trucks to Thula, where they were released into a specially prepared enclosure with reinforced fencing and electrified barriers. Lawrence had 72 hours to prove these elephants could be saved before authorities would arrive to carry out the destruction order anyway. The moment the elephants recovered from tranquilization, they demonstrated exactly why they were considered unsalvageable. Nana, the matriarch, immediately began testing the fence. She was a massive female, weighing close to 4 tons, with intelligence that shone in her dark eyes and rage that radiated from every movement. She probed the electric fence methodically, using branches to test which areas delivered the strongest shocks, backing away when hurt, but always returning with new strategies. Behind her, the rest of the herd watched and learned, waiting for their leader to find the weakness that would allow escape. Lawrence knew he had to establish communication immediately, but traditional approaches would not work with elephants this traumatized. He could not simply observe from a distance and hope they would acclimate. He needed to demonstrate that he was different from the humans who had destroyed their families, but doing so required getting close to animals actively seeking to harm any person they encountered. Against all advice, Lawrence took his sleeping bag and camped directly next to the fence line. He positioned himself where the elephants could see him clearly, making himself completely vulnerable. His staff thought he had signed his own death warrant. If Nana broke through the fence during the night, Lawrence would be the first person she would reach, and an enraged elephant could kill a human in seconds. That first night lasted an eternity. Lawrence sat on his camp chair, talking quietly to the elephants in the darkness, knowing they could hear him even if they could not understand his words. He spoke about his intentions for the reserve, about his commitment to their safety, about his understanding of what they had suffered. He knew this sounded absurd to anyone listening, but he also knew that elephants could sense emotional intention, that his calm presence might communicate something that words alone never could. Nana paced the fence line through the night, never taking her eyes off the human who had placed himself within her reach. Several times she charged the fence, stopping just short of contact, testing whether Lawrence would run. He never moved. Other elephants in the herd vocalized distress calls, clearly disturbed by the human presence, but Lawrence remained in position, maintaining his calm dialogue with creatures who had every reason to want him dead. As dawn broke on that first morning, something shifted. Nana stopped pacing. She stood at the fence directly across from Lawrence, trunk raised, and for the first time since arriving at Thula Thula, she was completely still. Lawrence stood as well, maintaining eye contact, extending his hand toward the fence in a gesture of peace. For several long minutes, woman and man regarded each other across the barrier. Then Nana turned and walked slowly back to her herd. That moment marked the beginning of what would become one of the most documented cases of human-elephant relationship building in conservation history. Lawrence continued his nightly vigil, camping at the fence regardless of weather, making himself a constant, non-threatening presence in the elephants' lives. He brought the herd their favorite foods, placed carefully just inside the fence line where they could access it safely. He played music, a mix of classical and African rhythms, believing that sound might soothe their traumatized minds. The breakthrough came on the seventh night. Lawrence had fallen asleep in his chair, exhausted from days without proper rest. He woke to find Nana standing directly at the fence, just feet away, close enough that he could hear her breathing. She was not aggressive. She was observing him with that intense, intelligent gaze that elephants use when processing complex information. Lawrence remained perfectly still, barely breathing, allowing her to study him without interference. After what might have been minutes or hours, time having lost all normal meaning in that charged moment, Nana made a sound. It was not the rumble of aggression or the trumpet of alarm. It was a soft, low-frequency vocalization that elephant researchers recognize as a contact call. The sound elephants use to communicate reassurance within their family groups. She was speaking to him, acknowledging his presence not as threat, but as something else entirely. From that night forward, the relationship transformed gradually but undeniably. Nana began allowing Lawrence to approach the fence without charging. The other elephants, taking their cues from their matriarch's behavior, showed less aggression and more curiosity. Within 3 weeks, the herd had stopped attempting to escape. Within 2 months, Lawrence was able to enter the enclosure on foot, walking among elephants who could have killed him effortlessly, but instead allowed his presence with something approaching acceptance. The most remarkable development came when Nana allowed Lawrence to touch her. In elephant society, physical contact is reserved for family members and carries profound meaning. The first time Lawrence placed his hand on Nana's massive shoulder, feeling the rough, warm skin and the powerful muscles beneath, he understood that he had been accepted into the herd's social structure in some capacity that defied conventional understanding of animal behavior. Over the following years, the bond between Lawrence and Nana's herd deepened into something that researchers came from around the world to study. The elephants learned to respond to Lawrence's voice, approaching when he called, allowing him to walk freely within their group. More importantly, they demonstrated behaviors toward him that elephants typically reserved for family members. They would greet him with gentle trunk touches, a form of elephant communication that conveys affection and recognition. They allowed him to approach their calves, a privilege that required absolute trust, as elephant mothers are notoriously protective. Lawrence documented years of interactions that challenged scientific assumptions about the emotional and cognitive capabilities of elephants. He observed the herd's complex social structures, their problem-solving abilities, their capacity for what appeared to be empathy, and even humor. He watched as Nana taught younger elephants to interact peacefully with humans, passing down knowledge that humans could be trusted, at least in this one protected space. But perhaps most significant was what the elephants taught Lawrence about their capacity for memory. Elephants are famous for their extraordinary recall, with brains structured to retain vast amounts of spatial, social, and emotional information over decades. Lawrence witnessed this firsthand as the herd navigated the reserve, remembering water sources, food locations, and safe paths with precision that bordered on uncanny. They remembered individual humans, reacting differently to staff members based on previous interactions, demonstrating that their memories were not just spatial, but deeply personal. This ability to remember would become crucial to understanding what happened years later, when these elephants made an impossible journey to honor the man who had saved them. But first, there was another herd to save. In 2003, 4 years after Nana's arrival, Lawrence received another desperate call. A second elephant herd, this one led by a massive matriarch named Frankie, was facing destruction. Like Nana's herd, these elephants had been traumatized by human violence and had developed dangerous, aggressive behaviors. Unlike Nana's group, this herd had actually killed a person, a wildlife officer who had been involved in culling operations. The sentence was absolute. This herd would be destroyed immediately unless Lawrence could perform another miracle. The decision to bring Frankie's herd to Thula was even more controversial than accepting Nana's family. Lawrence now had 9 elephants who had learned to trust him, and he was introducing 7 more elephants with no reason to trust anyone. The potential for catastrophic conflict between the herds, or for the new arrivals to trigger violent regression in Nana's rehabilitated group, was enormous. Lawrence prepared for their arrival with everything he had learned from his experience with Nana. He created a separate enclosure adjacent to the original herd's territory, allowing the groups to see and smell each other without direct contact. He began his nightly vigils again, camping at the fence, talking quietly to these new traumatized souls who had learned that humans meant death and penin. Frankie was, if anything, more damaged than Nana had been. She had witnessed the killing of her mother, her aunts, and several calves during culling operations. She had been shot herself, carrying bullets in her shoulder that caused chronic pain. Her hatred of humans was absolute and justified. The first time she saw Lawrence, she charged the fence with genuine intent to kill, trumpeting rage and grief that carried across the entire reserve. The rehabilitation of Frankie's herd took longer than Nana's. The process was complicated by Frankie's physical pain, which required treatment that initially reinforced her fear and hatred of humans. Lawrence worked with wildlife veterinarians to develop a protocol that would allow them to treat Frankie's injuries without tranquilizing her, which would have been seen as an attack. It took months of patient work, building trust in microscopic increments, before Frankie would allow Lawrence close enough to touch her wounded shoulder. The turning point came when Nana intervened. The 2 matriarchs had been aware of each other since Frankie's arrival, communicating through the fence with low-frequency vocalizations that humans could barely hear. One morning, Lawrence arrived to find both herds gathered at the fence line separating their territories. Nana and Frankie stood facing each other across the barrier, trunks extended, engaged in what could only be described as conversation. What happened next astonished everyone who witnessed it. Nana began making a series of specific vocalizations while looking deliberately at Lawrence, then at Frankie, then back at Lawrence. She repeated this pattern until Frankie, still maintaining her distance, began to calm. It appeared that Nana was communicating something about Lawrence to the other matriarch, essentially vouching for his trustworthiness based on her own 4 years of experience. Whether this interpretation was scientifically accurate or anthropomorphic projection remains debated among researchers. What was undeniable was the result. After that day, Frankie's aggression toward Lawrence decreased measurably. She began allowing him closer, though still maintaining careful distance. Within 6 months, both herds were living peacefully in their separate but adjacent territories, with Lawrence moving freely between both groups. The decision to merge the herds came a year after Frankie's arrival. Lawrence consulted with elephant behavior specialists who warned that integration could result in violent conflict, particularly between the two matriarchs competing for dominance. But Lawrence had observed something in the interactions between Nana and Frankie that gave him confidence. These two leaders had developed respect for each other, communicating regularly through the fence, coordinating their movements in ways that suggested cooperation rather than competition. The fence separating the territories was removed on a morning chosen for its calm weather and the herd's relaxed state. Staff positioned themselves at strategic points, ready to intervene if violence erupted. Lawrence stood in the middle of the space where the fence had been, making himself a bridge between the two groups, trusting that his relationship with both matriarchs would prevent disaster. Nana's herd approached first, with the matriarch leading cautiously, trunk raised to catch Frankie's scent. Frankie's herd came from the opposite direction, moving with equal caution. The two matriarchs met in the center, with Lawrence standing just feet away, and began an elaborate greeting ritual that included trunk touches, vocalizations, and careful physical contact. It was a conversation in elephant language, establishing boundaries and hierarchy through methods humans could observe but not fully understand. What could have been a violent confrontation became a peaceful merger. Within hours, the two herds had integrated into a single large group, with both matriarchs maintaining leadership in a shared structure that accommodated the wisdom of both individuals. The combined herd of 16 elephants established Thula as their permanent home, with Lawrence Anthony as their trusted guardian, and, in some capacity that defied simple categorization, their family. Over the following 8 years, Lawrence's relationship with the elephant herd became the central focus of his life. He walked with them daily, learning to interpret the subtle signals that indicated their emotional states, their intentions, their responses to the environment. He could identify each individual elephant by appearance, personality, and behavioral patterns. More remarkably, they could identify him, responding to his specific voice and presence in ways that they did not respond to other humans. Lawrence wrote about these experiences in his book, The Elephant Whisperer, which became an international bestseller and brought global attention to Thula. The book documented not just his work with the elephants, but his broader philosophy of conservation based on respect, communication, and recognition of animals as individuals with complex emotional and cognitive lives. Critics in the scientific community questioned some of his interpretations, suggesting he attributed too much human-like consciousness to elephant behavior. But his supporters, including many field researchers who had witnessed similar behaviors, argued that Lawrence was simply ahead of his time in recognizing capabilities that science was only beginning to acknowledge. The elephants at Thula became ambassadors for their species. Researchers came to study the herd's rehabilitation and social dynamics. Documentary filmmakers captured footage of Lawrence walking among wild elephants, who treated him with gentle familiarity. Conservation organizations used Thula as a model for elephant rehabilitation programs worldwide. The reserve became proof that traumatized elephants could recover, that human-wildlife conflict was not inevitable, and that individual relationships between species could exist outside the framework of domestication or traditional training methods. But beyond the public attention and scientific interest, something more profound was developing. The elephants were not just tolerating Lawrence's presence or responding to conditioning. They were engaging with him in ways that suggested genuine affection and attachment. When Lawrence traveled away from the reserve, the elephants would become restless, particularly Nana and Frankie, who seemed to track his absence and react to his return, keen with obvious enthusiasm. When he was present, they would seek him out, approaching his vehicle when he drove through the reserve, vocalizing greeting calls when they heard his voice. These behaviors could not be easily explained by food reward systems or simple conditioning. The elephants received consistent care from multiple staff members, but they responded to Lawrence differently, suggesting that they had formed a specific bond with this particular human based on their shared history and the trust he had established during those critical early months of rehabilitation. Lawrence understood the privilege and responsibility of this relationship. He used his platform to advocate for elephant conservation across Africa, fighting against culling practices, opposing ivory trade, and working to establish corridors between fragmented reserves where elephants could move safely. He traveled extensively for these causes, but always returned to Thula, always checked on his herd, always maintained the daily presence that had become essential to both his life and theirs. By 2012, Lawrence was 61 years old. He had survived numerous close calls during his decades in African conservation, including charges by dangerous animals, confrontations with poachers, and the general hazards of life in wild country. But he had never fully recovered from a severe heart condition that had been diagnosed years earlier. Despite medical warnings, he continued his intensive work schedule, driven by conviction that the conservation battles he was fighting could not wait for his health to improve. On March 2, 2012, Lawrence spent the morning with the elephant herd as he did most mornings. Staff members later reported that he seemed in good spirits, though perhaps more tired than usual. He walked among the elephants for over an hour, paying particular attention to several young calves born at the reserve, second-generation elephants who had never known trauma or fear of humans. These calves represented everything Lawrence had worked for: elephants living peacefully, raising families, existing without the terror that had marked their parents' lives. Nana and Frankie both approached Lawrence that morning, touching him gently with their trunks, in what had become a familiar greeting ritual. According to David, one of the senior rangers who was present, Lawrence spent several minutes with each matriarch, speaking quietly to them, running his hands along their massive shoulders. It was an ordinary morning, unremarkable except in hindsight, when every detail would be analyzed for meaning that might not exist. Lawrence returned to his home on the reserve in the early afternoon. He was working in his office, preparing documents for an upcoming conservation conference, when he experienced a massive heart attack. Françoise found him unconscious and called for emergency medical assistance, but it was too late. Despite desperate attempts at resuscitation, Lawrence Anthony died at his home on March 2, 2012, surrounded by the wild land he had spent his life protecting. The news spread quickly through the small community of conservation workers and staff at Thula. Grief was immediate and overwhelming. Lawrence had been more than an employer or colleague. He had been the driving force behind everything the reserve represented. His death left a void that no one could imagine filling. Plans were made for a private funeral with family and close friends to be held in 2 days. But the elephants knew something had changed before any human told them. On the afternoon of March 2nd, just hours after Lawrence's death, rangers reported unusual behavior from the herd. The elephants had gathered in a tight group, standing motionless in a formation they typically used when threatened or distressed. They remained in this position for hours, occasionally vocalizing low-frequency calls that carried across the reserve. They refused food. They showed no interest in their normal activities. Something was clearly wrong, though at the time, staff attributed this to general unease that elephants often display during storms or other environmental stresses. The next morning, March 3rd, the unusual behavior continued. The herd remained clustered, moving very little, maintaining their distressed vocalizations. Several rangers approached to check on their welfare, But the elephants showed no interest in human contact, unusual for animals who typically engaged with familiar staff. By afternoon, something even more unexpected occurred. The herd began moving as a group toward the southern boundary of the reserve, toward Lawrence's home. This area was accessible to the elephants, but was not part of their normal ranging territory. They had no obvious reason to go there. Yet Nana led the entire group, 16 elephants walking in deliberate formation, directly toward the place where Lawrence Anthony had died the previous day. They stopped approximately 100 meters from the house, in a clearing where they could see the building but were not close enough to alarm the grieving family. And there they remained, standing in complete stillness, making no sound. The behavior was so unusual that rangers called Françoise to inform her of the situation, concerned that something might be wrong with the elephants. Françoise, devastated by her husband's death, looked out to see the entire elephant herd standing in silent vigil. She understood immediately what was happening. On the morning of March 4th, as dawn broke over Thula, the situation became even more extraordinary. The security guard at the main entrance to the reserve radioed in with an urgent message. Wild elephants were gathering outside the gates. Not the resident herd, but different elephants, coming from outside the reserve boundaries. By mid-morning, an entire herd was positioned at the entrance, displaying the same strange stillness that characterized the resident herd's behavior. These were elephants that Lawrence had worked with years earlier, in the early days after Nana's arrival, when neighboring reserves had sought his advice on managing their own elephant populations. These elephants had not lived at Thula for years. They had returned to wild territories outside the reserve boundaries, living their lives in areas where Lawrence only occasionally traveled. Yet somehow, they had known to come back. They had traveled through dangerous territory, risking their lives, to reach this specific location on this specific day. By afternoon, a third group had appeared, approaching from yet another direction. This group was even more mysterious. Records suggested these were elephants that Lawrence had encountered only briefly, years ago, during a rescue operation in a distant province. They had traveled even farther than the second group, covering what must have been 15 or 20 miles through territory where wild elephants were constantly at risk from farmers, hunters, and conflict with human settlements. For 2 full days, these multiple elephant herds maintained their positions around Thula and Lawrence's home. They did not eat, despite ample vegetation available. They did not engage in their normal social behaviors. They did not make noise beyond the occasional low-frequency rumble that served to maintain group cohesion. They simply stood in that profound, unmistakable stillness. The staff at Thula were witnessing something that seemed impossible. Elephants are known to mourn their own dead, returning to the bones of deceased family members, showing behaviors that researchers interpret as grief. But this was something different. These were wild elephants mourning a human being, gathering from distant locations to pay respects to someone who had earned a place in their memory and hearts so profound that his death triggered a response previously thought unique to elephant-on-elephant relationships. Françoise Anthony, despite her overwhelming grief, recognized the significance of what was happening. She arranged for researchers and photographers to document the gathering, understanding that this represented something science needed to record. Dr. Du Grobler, a wildlife veterinarian who had worked closely with Lawrence and the Thula herd, arrived to observe and was moved to tears by what he witnessed. "I have studied elephants for 30 years, Dr. Grobler later stated in interviews. I have seen them mourn their dead, have documented their complex social behaviors, their remarkable intelligence. But I have never seen anything like this. These elephants came from different herds, from different territories, some of them traveling dangerous distances through areas where they are actively hunted. They arrived on the day of Lawrence's death, or within hours of it. They positioned themselves at his home and maintained a mourning vigil that is identical to the behavior elephants display for their own matriarchs. The only possible explanation is that they somehow knew he had died, and they came to honor him. The question of how the elephants knew about Lawrence's death remains scientifically controversial. Elephants communicate through infrasound, low-frequency vocalizations that can travel for miles, potentially conveying information across distances that humans cannot monitor. Some researchers theorize that the resident herd, sensing or understanding that something terrible had happened to their human friend, may have broadcast distress calls that other elephants heard and responded to. Others suggest that elephants have cognitive and possibly even sensory capabilities that science has not yet fully documented, allowing them to perceive environmental or emotional changes in ways that defy current understanding. What is undeniable is that it happened. Multiple witnesses, including rangers, researchers, and documentary crews, confirmed that wild elephant herds traveled to Thula immediately following Lawrence Anthony's death and held vigil for 2 days. The behavior was too specific, too precisely timed, and too emotionally charged to be dismissed as coincidence or anthropomorphic projection. On the morning after Lawrence's funeral, after the family had said their final goodbyes and the last guests had departed, the elephants finally moved. Each herd returned to their territories, the resident group remaining at Thula, while the visiting herds retraced their dangerous journeys back to wild lands. Before departing, Nana and Frankie approached the area where Lawrence had been buried, a spot chosen on the reserve within sight of the mountains he had loved. They stood at the gravesite for several minutes, trunks touching the ground where he lay, performing what researchers recognize as elephant mourning behavior. Then they turned and walked slowly back toward their range, pausing occasionally to look back, before disappearing into the bush. It appeared to be a final goodbye. The death of Lawrence Anthony and the elephant funeral, as it came to be known, made international news. The story spread across social media, through conservation networks, and into mainstream journalism. People who had never heard of Thula or Lawrence Anthony were moved to tears by images of wild elephants standing in silent vigil for the man who had saved them. The story resonated because it challenged fundamental assumptions about the boundaries between human and animal consciousness, about the capacity of wildlife to form meaningful bonds with individual humans, and about the depth of emotion and cognition that elephants possess. Some skeptics attempted to provide alternative explanations. Perhaps the elephants were responding to unusual activity at the reserve, to the presence of many unfamiliar humans during the funeral preparations. Perhaps their gathering was coincidental, unrelated to Lawrence's death. Perhaps the behavior was being misinterpreted through the lens of human grief, imposing emotional motivations on animals simply responding to environmental cues. But these explanations fail to account for the specificity of the behavior, the precise timing, the multiple independent herds arriving from different locations, and the maintained vigil over 2 days. Moreover, they failed to account for what every person who had worked with Lawrence and the elephants knew beyond doubt, that these animals had formed a genuine relationship with him, that they responded to his presence differently than to other humans, and that their reaction to his death was consistent with the mourning behaviors elephants display for their own family members. Thula continued operating after Lawrence's death, with Francoise and the dedicated staff working to maintain everything he had built. The elephant herds remained at the reserve, now under the care of rangers who had learned from Lawrence's approach. The bonds that had been established proved durable, even without his daily presence. Nana and Frankie continued leading their combined herd, raising calves, living the peaceful lives that Lawrence had fought to give them. But the story was not finished. In the years following Lawrence's death, staff at Thula began noticing a peculiar pattern. On March 2nd each year, the anniversary of Lawrence's death, the elephant herd would gather near his gravesite. They would stand in quiet observation, sometimes for hours, before returning to their normal activities. This behavior repeated annually, suggesting that the elephants not only remembered Lawrence, but marked the specific date of his death in ways that implied conscious awareness of time passing. Even more remarkably, in 2023, 11 years after Lawrence's death, Françoise reported that one of the distant herds, elephants that had come for the original funeral vigil, returned to Thula. Rangers identified several individuals from the 2012 group based on distinctive physical features and markings. These elephants appeared at the reserve in early March, positioned themselves near the area where they had held vigil 11 years earlier, and remained for a day before departing. They had returned for the anniversary. This behavior challenges everything science thought it understood about elephant memory and emotional processing. Annual returns to sites associated with deceased family members are well documented in elephant behavior. But those returns typically diminish over time and are generally limited to locations where elephants regularly range. For a wild herd to travel dangerous distances to visit the grave of a human 11 years after his death suggests memory and emotional attachment that operates on timescales and with specificity that researchers are only beginning to acknowledge as possible. Dr. Caitlin O'Connell Rodwell, an elephant researcher at Stanford University who studied the Thula events, published findings that support the legitimacy of these observations. Her research demonstrated that elephants possess temporal memory capabilities far exceeding previous scientific assumptions. They can remember specific locations, specific individuals, and apparently specific events across decades. Their brains, particularly the hippocampus and areas associated with emotional processing, are structured to maintain vast amounts of detailed information about their social worlds and personal histories. What happened at Thula forces us to expand our understanding of elephant cognition, Dr. O'Connell Rodwell stated in her published analysis. We can no longer dismiss elephant behaviors as purely instinctual or as simple responses to immediate environmental stimuli. These animals demonstrate sophisticated emotional lives, long-term memory that includes specific relationships with individual humans, and behavioral responses that meet every reasonable definition of grief, loyalty, and conscious remembrance. The elephants who mourned Lawrence Anthony were not responding to abstract concepts. They were grieving the loss of a specific individual who had earned a place in their social and emotional worlds. The legacy of Lawrence Anthony and his relationship with the elephant herds at Thula extends far beyond scientific research. His story has become a touchstone in the broader conversation about animal consciousness, ethical conservation practices, and the possibilities for coexistence between humans and wildlife. The elephant funeral has been referenced in countless articles, books, and documentaries as evidence that the line between human and animal emotional experience is far less distinct than traditional science claimed. More practically, the methods Lawrence developed for rehabilitating traumatized elephants have been adopted by conservation programs worldwide. His emphasis on patient relationship building, on respect for individual elephant personalities, and on recognizing animals as sentient beings with complex emotional needs rather than simply as wildlife management problems, has influenced policy and practice across Africa and beyond. Sanctuaries and reserves now regularly employ approaches directly inspired by Lawrence's work at Thula Thula. Perhaps most importantly, the story reminds us that individual actions matter in conservation. Lawrence Anthony was not a wealthy foundation or a government agency. He was one person who chose to say yes when others said no, who chose to trust when conventional wisdom demanded fear, who chose to believe that traumatized elephants could heal and that relationships between species were possible beyond the narrow frameworks of domestication or dominance. And in doing so, he not only saved 16 elephants from certain death, but demonstrated possibilities that continue to inspire conservationists and animal advocates worldwide. Today, visitors to Thula Thula can see the elephant herds that Lawrence saved, now expanded through births to over 30 individuals. They roam freely across the reserve, living peaceful lives, raising calves who have never known the trauma their grandmothers experienced. Nana passed away in 2016 at an advanced age, her death mourned by the herd in the same ritualistic way that elephants have marked the passing of their matriarchs for millions of years. Frankie remains as of 2024, now the eldest member of the herd, carrying within her brain the memories of everything she survived and everyone who helped her survive. And on March 2nd each year, the elephants gather near Lawrence Anthony's grave, maintaining their vigil, honoring their promise that the man who saved them would never be forgotten. They stand in that profound stillness, these massive creatures with brains that rival our own in complexity, with emotions that mirror our deepest feelings, with memories that span decades and distances we can barely comprehend. They remember. And in remembering, they teach us something essential about the nature of consciousness, connection, and love that transcends the boundaries we thought separated their world from ours. The elephant funeral at Thula Thula stands as testament to a fundamental truth that indigenous cultures have long understood, but that Western science is only beginning to acknowledge. Animals are not unconscious machines responding blindly to instinct. They are individuals with rich emotional lives, with capacity for loyalty and grief and love that deserves recognition and respect. Lawrence Anthony knew this truth intuitively. The elephants who mourned him proved it beyond any reasonable doubt. And everyone who hears their story is challenged to reconsider every assumption about the boundaries between human and animal, about who is capable of conscious thought and genuine emotion, and about what we owe to the remarkable beings with whom we share this planet. If this story moved you, if it changed how you see the relationship between humans and animals, if it reminded you that love and loyalty know no boundaries of species or language, then please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to Wildlife Tales, and turn on notifications so you never miss stories about the extraordinary bonds that connect all living beings. Share this with someone who needs to remember that consciousness, emotion, and family extend far beyond human experience. And remember the elephants of Thula Thula, who proved that some promises are kept forever, that some bonds survive even death, and that the greatest measure of a life is found in who remembers us when we are gone.